What would you do if your life fell apart in front of your eyes, at the very moment you thought everything was perfect? Tonight, a husband exposed his wife's affair at their surprise anniversary dinner, but the shocking twist. It wasn't just about betrayal, it was about revenge, control, and a choice that would destroy everything they once had. Stay tuned to find out why this man waited months to reveal the truth, and how one decision shattered their world forever. It was supposed to be the perfect evening. He'd spent weeks planning it. Everything had to be just right. The husband had set up a surprise anniversary dinner for his wife, one she would never forget. The candles were flickering on the table, the soft glow creating a romantic atmosphere. Her favorite flowers filled the room with a sweet fragrance, and the table was set with all of their favorite dishes. The guests had arrived too. Close friends, family, everyone she loved was there. It seemed like the ideal way to celebrate another year of their marriage. For most people, it was the kind of celebration you'd look forward to, the kind you'd expect to be filled with laughter, love, and fond memories. But there was something about the whole night that felt off. Something the wife couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't just the fact that her husband was acting a bit too calm, or that he'd been oddly distant the past few months. There was this feeling in the air, like something was waiting to happen. Maybe she hadn't noticed, or maybe she didn't want to see it. But she wasn't blind. She knew her husband had been acting strange lately. He had been quiet, almost withdrawn, and there was this constant sense of tension whenever they were alone together. Still, she brushed it off. After all, this was supposed to be a celebration, a night to enjoy. She had no idea that everything was about to change, that everything she thought she knew about her marriage was about to be torn apart, right there, in front of everyone. The husband had planned this dinner meticulously, but it wasn't just for the celebration. It was for something else, something she didn't expect. He wasn't just celebrating their anniversary. He was about to expose a secret that had been eating away at him for months, a secret he could no longer keep hidden. As the evening unfolded, the wife felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. She noticed her husband's quiet demeanor, but she dismissed it as pre-dinner nerves. He'd always been a bit of a perfectionist after all, but deep down she had no clue that the man who had planned this beautiful evening was about to expose something that would shatter her world. What she didn't know was that this anniversary dinner was not going to be the celebration she expected. It was going to be the moment her life changed forever, the moment everything she took for granted would come crumbling down. And the twist? The reason behind the husband's plan wasn't just about revenge, it was about something far deeper than that. But what was it? That's something we'll uncover as we move deeper into this story. Stay with me, because this is just the beginning. As the night wore on, the wife couldn't help but notice how distant her husband had been lately. Sure, he smiled when she spoke, nodded along to the conversations around the table, but there was something in his eyes. It was like he was somewhere else, caught up in thoughts she couldn't reach. And it wasn't just that evening. Looking back, there had been little signs, small things that she had brushed aside. Late-night phone calls that he quickly ended when she entered the room. Texts he'd deleted without a second thought. His sudden obsession with checking his phone, even in the middle of dinner or when they were watching TV together. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But at the same time, she tried to convince herself she was just being paranoid. It was their anniversary after all, a time to celebrate their love, their years together. Why spoil it with doubts? But doubts didn't go away that easily. They lingered. Her husband, once so open and warm, had grown colder. He no longer laughed like he used to, or engaged in the light-hearted chats they once shared. She found herself questioning if it was just the stress of life, maybe work or other pressures building up. After all, their lives hadn't been perfect. Whose marriage ever is? But this felt different. Then there was the neighbor. It was hard to ignore how close the neighbor had become to them over the past few months. He'd been around more often, helping with things around the house, lending a hand when it was needed. She remembered the small, seemingly innocent exchanges between them. A laugh here, a touch on the shoulder there. Nothing alarming at first. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on, something that hadn't been there before. For a while she kept telling herself it was nothing, just her overactive imagination running wild. But deep down, she knew. She knew that the way her husband had been acting wasn't normal. Something had changed, and she had a sinking feeling that the truth was something she wasn't ready to hear. It wasn't until she overheard a conversation between her husband and the neighbor one evening that the full weight of her fears came crashing down. It wasn't a loud argument. In fact, it was almost too quiet, too calm. But it was enough. Enough for her to catch a few words, a few that were like daggers to her heart. The husband's voice, low but clear, as he said, "I know what's been going on. I've seen everything." The neighbor's voice followed, unsure and shaky, but still, it was enough. "I never meant for it to happen, but it did." Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart raced. The truth was now right in front of her, but she couldn't process it. She wanted to walk away, to pretend she hadn't heard. But it was too late. She couldn't unhear it. And at that moment, the anniversary dinner she thought would be a celebration of love suddenly turned into the stage for something far darker, a betrayal that would soon be revealed to everyone. And the husband? He had been waiting for the right moment. Tonight, he had finally decided, was the moment to expose everything. But why wait until now? Why not confront her privately, away from everyone? What had led him to this point? What was going through his mind? That's the twist to come. Because what he planned next was nothing short of explosive. The evening continued as if nothing had changed. The guests were enjoying their meals, chatting, laughing, unaware of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. The wife, still trying to convince herself that she must have misunderstood, carried on with the evening as if everything was normal. She laughed along with the others, nodding when people complimented the beautiful setup and the delicious food. But inside, her mind was racing, her heart pounding. The conversation she had overheard was playing on a loop in her head, each word echoing louder than the last. Her husband, however, remained strangely composed. His calmness was unsettling. He was polite, even charming, as he moved between guests, making sure everyone was enjoying themselves. But there was no warmth in his smile, no genuine interest in the conversations. He was distant, almost like a man on a mission, like he was waiting for the right moment to make his move. The wife kept stealing glances at him, wondering what was going on behind that stoic face. She had known him for years, and yet tonight he seemed like a stranger. It wasn't just the way he had spoken to the neighbor earlier. It was the way he was acting now, the way he had been acting for months. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how deep it went. She tried to shake off the unease, telling herself to just enjoy the night. After all, it was their anniversary, and nothing was more important than celebrating the years they had shared together, right? But as the evening wore on, she began to notice subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, as if something was about to break. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just another dinner. This was the calm before the storm. The husband had planned every detail with precision. He had carefully chosen the timing, waiting until everyone was gathered, until the night felt comfortable and safe. The dinner had lulled everyone into a false sense of security. It was the perfect setting for a revelation, and the husband knew this better than anyone. By now the guests were a little more than tipsy, their laughter filling the room, their chatter growing louder. The wife noticed that her husband's eyes seemed to flicker with something she couldn't quite place. Was it anger, resentment, or was it something else entirely? As the evening stretched on, the wife's anxiety grew. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be good. The tension in the air thickened, and it felt like everyone, even the guests, could sense that something wasn't right. But no one, not even the wife, had any idea what was about to unfold. Finally, the moment came. The husband stood up, raised his glass, and called for everyone's attention. For a moment, the room fell silent. His voice, calm but firm, broke through the hushed whispers. "I want to say something," he began, his words cutting through the atmosphere like a knife. The wife froze. This wasn't part of the plan. She felt a chill run down her spine, her heart racing as her breath caught in her throat. What was he about to say? What happened next would change everything. The calm, quiet evening she thought was going to be a celebration was about to explode in a way she never saw coming. The twist. It wasn't just the affair he was about to expose, it was the truth behind why he'd waited until this moment to reveal it. The room fell silent as the husband's voice echoed through the quiet, each word hanging in the air like a heavy weight. "I've been sitting on a secret for months now," her husband continued, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto hers. There was no warmth in his gaze anymore, only a coldness that made her feel like she was shrinking under the weight of his words. "But I can't keep it in any longer. Not tonight. Not in front of everyone." The wife's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what he was about to say. Had he figured it out? Did he know? Her thoughts were a blur of panic, but before she could make sense of anything, he said the words that would change everything. "I know about the affair," he stated flatly. The room seemed to spin around her, the words ringing in her ears like a cruel, unrelenting echo. The affair. It was real, the thing she had spent months denying, brushing aside. Now it was out in the open. She felt the color drain from her face. The shock was so overwhelming, she almost couldn't hear the murmurs that rippled through the guests. Some were whispering, some just staring, trying to process what had just been dropped on them. But all she could hear was the steady thumping of her own heartbeat. The realization hit her like a freight train. There was no way out. Her secret was out, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The husband's voice never wavered as he continued, his words slow but deliberate. "You thought you could hide it from me. You thought I wouldn't notice the late nights, the secret messages, the way you've been looking at him." He paused, letting the weight of his accusations sink in. "Well, I noticed. I saw everything, and I couldn't pretend anymore." At that moment, the wife wanted to disappear. Her hands trembled, her face flushed with a mix of humiliation and fear. How could he do this? In front of everyone, in front of their closest friends. She had hoped for some form of quiet resolution, something private. But this wasn't a conversation. This was an explosion, a public execution of everything she had tried to hide. But the husband wasn't done. "And that neighbor of ours, he thought he could get away with it too," he said, his eyes now moving from her to the neighbor standing awkwardly near the door, clearly caught off guard by the sudden spotlight. Well, he was wrong. The neighbor looked like a deer caught in headlights. The wife's gaze flicked between the two men, the gravity of the situation sinking in deeper with every passing second. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stop, but the words caught in her throat. What could she possibly say? What was left to say when everything had already been laid bare for everyone to see? The silence that followed was deafening. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to find some semblance of composure. But it was too late. The truth had been exposed. And as the realization hit her, she knew there was no going back. There was no escaping the consequences of what had just been revealed. But even as the room processed what had just happened, the husband wasn't finished. There was something more, something deeper, behind why he had chosen this moment, this very public setting, to confront her. And it wasn't just about revenge. It was about something she never saw coming. The twist was still coming. The story was far from over. The room was frozen, every eye locked on the wife, waiting for some reaction. But it wasn't just her who was affected. The neighbor, standing by the door with his face flushed red, suddenly seemed to shrink under the weight of the husband's words. The realization hit him just as hard as it hit the wife. This wasn't just an affair exposed in private. This was a public declaration, a brutal unveiling of everything they had tried to keep hidden. For a moment, the neighbor didn't know what to do. He looked from the husband to the wife, his expression a mix of guilt and panic, but he didn't speak. What could he say? There was no defense, no way to talk his way out of this. The truth was out, and there was no place to hide. The guests sat there, motionless, as the awkwardness in the air became almost suffocating. The wife could barely look at him. This was the man who had been a trusted friend, someone they had both welcomed into their home. The thought of the nights they had shared, sitting on the porch, chatting about life, thinking everything was normal, now felt like a sick joke. He wasn't just the neighbor anymore. He was the man who had broken her trust, ruined her marriage, and exposed a truth she had worked so hard to deny. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, the neighbor spoke, his voice shaky and unsure. I never meant for it to happen like this." His words fell flat in the tense room, almost like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "I didn't want any of this to come out. It wasn't supposed to go this far." But his attempt to explain was met with cold silence. There was no room for excuses. No one was interested in hearing why it had happened, only that it had, and the damage was already done. The wife looked at him, her heart filled with anger and betrayal. How could he stand there, trying to explain himself, when everything had been laid bare in front of everyone they knew? The affair wasn't some mistake. It wasn't an accident. It had been planned, it had been secret, and it had been ongoing. The weight of his words, and her husband's, crushed her in ways she couldn't even process. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to run away from the horror of it all. But she didn't. She stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the floor as the room felt like it was closing in on her. Meanwhile, the husband's eyes were locked on the neighbor, the disdain in them almost palpable. "You thought you could just waltz in here into our lives and pretend everything was fine? That I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't care?" The husband's voice was low now, but the anger behind it was unmistakable. "You made a choice. You both made a choice. And now you're going to face the consequences." The neighbor's face turned even paler. He took a step back, glancing nervously around the room, his mind racing. Was he going to be thrown out? Was the husband going to hit him? Or worse, was he going to be kicked out of the circle of friends he had built with this family, forever tainted by the knowledge of his betrayal? But instead of lashing out physically, the husband did something more cutting. He turned to the wife. His expression softened, but the coldness in his eyes remained. "I waited until now to tell you," he said, his voice almost a whisper, but it carried across the room. "I wanted to see if you'd come clean. I wanted to see if you'd admit it yourself. But you didn't, and now everyone knows the truth." The wife's face flushed as the weight of his words hit her. The realization stung. He hadn't been trying to humiliate her. He hadn't even been trying to get revenge, at least not in the way she thought. He'd waited for her to confess. He had given her the chance to come clean on her own, but she hadn't, not once. And now the truth was out for everyone to see. The room was still. No one knew what to say next. But even as the neighbor stood there, trembling and defeated, the bigger twist was yet to come. The husband's true intentions weren't fully clear yet. Why had he exposed everything so publicly? Why wait until this moment to do it? What did he want to achieve by shattering their lives in front of their closest friends? The answer to that would come soon. But for now, the silence was deafening, and the consequences of the betrayal weighed heavy on everyone in the room. The wife stood there, frozen in place, her mind a chaotic mess of emotions. Anger, humiliation, guilt, each one fighting for dominance in her chest. She felt like the walls were closing in, suffocating her. The room was too quiet now, too still. It felt like everyone was waiting for her to say something, anything, but she couldn't find the words. How could she possibly explain this? How could she defend herself when the truth had been laid bare in front of everyone? The eyes of the guests were all on her now, their gazes ranging from sympathetic to judgmental. Some looked uncomfortable, unsure of how to react, while others stared in disbelief, struggling to understand how this could have happened. She could feel their eyes like hot needles on her skin, and it made her want to crawl into a hole and disappear. But there was nowhere to hide. The damage was done. The neighbor stood off to the side, awkwardly shifting on his feet, trying to avoid making eye contact. He seemed just as lost as she was, but there was something in the way he looked at her, a mix of regret and fear, as if he, too, was waiting for her to fix everything. But how could she? How could she fix this mess? Her husband, still standing with that cold, emotionless stare, waited for her to speak. But when she didn't, his expression darkened even further. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that was growing wider by the second. She knew that no matter what she said now, nothing would be enough. The trust was broken. The love they had shared, if it had ever been real, was shattered. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It felt weak, almost meaningless. She wasn't sure if she was apologizing to him, to herself, or to the guests who had been dragged into this nightmare. But the words felt empty, too little, too late. She had betrayed him, and no apology could undo the damage she had caused. But the husband wasn't interested in apologies. "Sorry?" he repeated, his voice rising. "That's all you have to say, after everything?" His words were sharp, laced with a bitterness she had never heard before. "You've destroyed everything, and you're sorry?" She could see the anger rising in his eyes now, a quiet fury that simmered beneath his controlled exterior. She had never seen him like this, so cold, so distant. It was like he wasn't even the same man anymore. And in that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about the affair anymore. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about everything that had led to this moment. The years of growing distance, the secrets they had kept from each other, the lies they had told to protect themselves. It had all come crashing down. The neighbors' faces were all a blur to her now. She couldn't focus on them, couldn't bring herself to meet their eyes. She was too wrapped up in the horror of the moment, too overwhelmed by the wave of shame and regret that washed over her. The weight of her actions was crushing. How had she let it get this far? How had she allowed herself to be swept away by temptation, knowing what it would do to her family, to her marriage? The husband was still watching her, waiting. And despite the sting of his words, despite the anger in his eyes, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to salvage this. Maybe if she could show him how sorry she was, how much she regretted it, they could start over. But deep down, she knew. The trust was broken. The damage was done. There was no easy way back from this. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling now, the tears threatening to spill. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just lost. I don't know what happened to us. I don't know how we got here." Her words sounded desperate even to her own ears, but there was no other way to express the helplessness she felt. The distance between them had grown so wide, and now it was too late to bridge that gap. But her husband wasn't moved. His expression softened, but only for a brief second before it hardened again. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice steady but laced with an edge of finality. "I gave you the chance. I waited for you to tell me the truth, but you didn't." The weight of his words hung in the air, and the wife could feel the last shreds of her hope slipping away. What could she say now? What could she do to make this right? There was nothing. There was no way to go back. And as the evening stretched on, it became clear. What had started as a simple anniversary dinner had now become the moment that would define the rest of their lives. The wife's heartache was real, but the husband's resolve was just as strong. Neither of them knew what the future held, but one thing was certain: the marriage they once knew was gone. The silence in the room was suffocating, and the weight of the moment was pressing down on everyone. The wife stood there, still frozen, her emotions a tangled mess. But the neighbor, realizing the gravity of the situation, seemed to snap out of his daze. He took a tentative step forward, clearly trying to regain some control over the situation. But every move he made seemed to only add to the tension, like someone who was already in too deep, trying desperately to stay afloat. I never meant for it to go this far," the neighbor said, his voice shaking. He looked at the wife, his eyes pleading, as if he could somehow make everything right. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. This wasn't supposed to happen. We never planned it, But the husband cut him off sharply. "Save it." His voice was cold, harder than ever. "You think this is about what was planned or not? You think this is about intentions?" He shook his head, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "You've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face, and now you want to stand there and tell me you never meant for it to go this far. It's too late for apologies." The neighbor stood there, his face a mixture of regret and fear. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words didn't come. Instead, he swallowed hard, as if he were trying to choke back the truth. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. His attempt to salvage the situation only seemed to make things worse, and deep down, he knew it. The room felt even colder now, the space between the husband, the wife, and the neighbor growing wider with every passing second. No one spoke, and the heavy silence was like a wall that no one could break through. The wife couldn't stand to look at either of them. Her eyes kept drifting between the two men, the one she loved and the one she had betrayed him with, and the shame, the guilt, the despair, all crashed over her like a wave. But even as the neighbor tried to apologize, there was no saving the situation. The truth had been exposed, and nothing could undo the hurt. The husband's rage wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about the complete violation of trust. Not just from his wife, but from the neighbor, someone they had both thought they could rely on. The betrayal ran deep, and it wasn't something that could be fixed with words. The neighbor, realizing he had no ground left to stand on, took a few steps back. He lowered his head, avoiding the eyes of the others, and waited for the storm to pass. But there was no storm that could wash away what had been done. No apology could undo the damage. The husband's eyes were fixed on the neighbor, but his words weren't for him anymore. He turned slowly to face his wife again, his expression unreadable. The anger that had bubbled up inside him was now simmering just beneath the surface, but there was something else in his eyes, something colder, more resolved. This wasn't just about the affair. It wasn't even about the humiliation he felt, or the betrayal. This was about the future, his future, and the future of his marriage, if there was even a future left to save. "I've had enough," he said, his voice low but firm. I can't pretend that this doesn't matter. I can't pretend that I don't feel the way I do, after everything that's happened." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The wife opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came out. She could feel the finality in his tone, the way his words sealed off any possibility of reconciliation. "Everything's been a lie," he continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. "All these years. I don't know what to believe anymore. And the worst part is, I don't even know if I can trust you again. Not after this. Not after you lied to my face." The wife's heart broke as she listened to him, the coldness in his words piercing through her chest. She wanted to reach out, to beg him to understand, to tell him that she never meant for any of it to happen, but nothing she could say would take away the pain, the deep, raw betrayal he must have felt. The trust they had built over the years was now in ruins, and no amount of pleading could put the pieces back together. The husband's gaze softened just a little, but it was a fleeting moment. He took a step back, distancing himself physically and emotionally. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "I'm done." The finality of his words hit her like a punch in the gut. She stumbled back, as if the force of his declaration had knocked the wind out of her. The truth was undeniable now. Her marriage was over, and there was no going back. The man she had loved for so many years had made his decision, and there was nothing she could do to change it. The room was eerily quiet again, the guests unsure of how to react. But they didn't need to say anything. The moment had already passed. The husband had made up his mind, and the wife, standing there, had no idea where she would go from here. There would be no fixing this, no second chances. The man she had betrayed had walked away, and the future she thought she had was now shattered. The night stretched on, but it felt like time had frozen. The laughter and chatter from earlier seemed like a distant memory now, a cruel reminder of what once was. The wife stood there, stunned, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. Her world, which had once been so stable and familiar, had collapsed in a matter of moments. There was no escaping the reality of it. The affair had torn apart the fabric of everything she had known, and the cold, final words from her husband echoed in her ears like a death sentence. "I'm done." Those words had been simple, but their impact was shattering. She had always known that trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild, but she never imagined it could crumble so quickly, so completely. And yet, here she was, standing in the ruins of her marriage, surrounded by friends and family who had watched the entire thing unfold. She didn't know what to do or where to go. She was a stranger in her own life, and the guilt weighed so heavily on her chest that it was hard to breathe. She turned to look at the neighbor, who still stood there in the corner, his face pale and haunted. He had no words left. The shock of it all had wiped him out, leaving him just as defeated as she felt. There was nothing either of them could say. The damage was done, and any attempt to fix it now would only make things worse. And yet, the neighbor wasn't completely off the hook. He had been a willing participant in this betrayal, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions too. But for the wife, it was hard to focus on him anymore. Her mind kept drifting back to her husband, to the hurt in his eyes when he had called it quits. The guests, those few who hadn't left, looked uncomfortable. Some whispered among themselves, unsure of how to react, while others just stared, lost in the heaviness of the situation. No one knew what to say. No one knew how to make this better. There was nothing anyone could do. The marriage was over, and the wife could feel every inch of it slipping away. The husband, meanwhile, had walked away from the table, his back now turned on the room. He had made his decision, and it was final. She wanted to run after him, to beg him for a second chance, but something stopped her. She knew it was pointless. The man she had once trusted had closed that door for good, and there was no way to open it again. He was gone, and so was she, in a way. The woman she used to be was no longer standing there. The realization hit her harder than any of the words he had spoken. Her life, her marriage, everything had been swept out from under her, and she didn't know how to stand again. She felt like a shadow of herself, lost in the consequences of her actions. As the evening drew to a close, the wife remained at the table, her gaze distant and unfocused. The guests, sensing the end of the night, had quietly started to leave, murmuring their goodbyes. The neighbor slipped out unnoticed, his exit as quiet and uncomfortable as his arrival. But it didn't matter. She didn't care where he went anymore. He was just as lost as she was, tangled in the same web of lies and regrets. She barely noticed the last few guests leaving. Her mind was consumed with one thought. How did it all come to this? How had everything fallen apart so quickly? She had tried to salvage her marriage. She had tried to explain herself, to apologize, but nothing worked. The damage was done, and now the man who had once been her partner, her confidant, had turned his back on her. The pain of that finality was something she would never forget. As she stood up from the table, her knees felt weak. She needed to leave, to get out of that house, out of the suffocating space where her entire world had just imploded. She walked slowly toward the door, her steps heavy. Each one felt like a goodbye. Each one felt like a piece of herself slipping away. But there was no stopping it. There was no going back to the life she had once known. The door slammed behind her as she stepped out into the cool night air, the reality of what had just happened settling over her like a cold blanket. She wasn't sure where she was going or what she was supposed to do next. All she knew was that her marriage was over, and nothing would ever be the same again. The street was empty. The lights flickered on the sidewalk, casting long shadows in the quiet night. She walked aimlessly, unsure of what she was even searching for. The truth was, she didn't know how to fix this. She didn't know if it could be fixed. The weight of everything, the affair, the lies, the hurt, was too much to bear, and she felt like she was drowning in it. In the distance, she could hear the sound of a car engine, but she didn't look up. She didn't want to face anyone, not yet. She needed time to think, time to process the fact that everything she thought she knew was gone. The man she loved had left her. The home they built together, the life they shared, it was all shattered in one evening. But even as the night pressed in around her, one thing was clear. There was no going back. She had made choices that could never be undone, and now she had to face the consequences. The break was final, and she was walking away from everything she had once known. As she took each step, she realized that this was the beginning of something new. Not because she wanted it, but because she had no other choice. The journey ahead would be painful, filled with regret and uncertainty. But it was hers to walk, alone. The days that followed were a blur. The wife found herself lost in the aftermath of everything that had happened. The house felt empty without him, the silence suffocating. There were no more late-night talks, no more shared moments of comfort. It was just her now, trying to come to terms with a reality that had been forced on her. She spent hours replaying the night in her head, wondering if she could have done things differently. But it was too late for that. The damage was irreversible, and the man she had loved was no longer there to fix things. She had betrayed him, and in the end, he had walked away. The neighbor? He had disappeared too, no longer a part of her life. She couldn't even bring herself to think about him anymore. Her focus was on herself now, on trying to pick up the pieces of a life she had broken. In the quiet of her own thoughts, the reality hit her harder than ever. She was alone. Not just in her marriage, but in the world. The future stretched out before her, uncertain and full of pain. There was no easy way to move on, but she knew she had to. She didn't know what came next, but she knew she couldn't stay in the past. She had to face the truth of her choices, and while it hurt, it was the only way forward. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She had to walk it alone. The life she had known was gone, and all that was left was the struggle to rebuild. The chapter was over, and now she had to find a way to start a new one.